Hello, this is Insight. Today on Insight, the conflict in Tigray. How did we get here? What is the current status? And what is the path forward? To discuss this, we have invited two distinguished scholars. Anne Fitz-Gerald, Director, School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada, Senior Security and Justice Advisor, UK Government, and Fellow Royal United Services Institute, UK. And our second distinguished guest, Hugh Segal, Mathews Fellow, Queen's University, Senior Advisor, Arid and Berlis LLP, and former Chair, Canadian Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to both of you. So let's start with Anne. Anne, what are the primary reasons that precipitated the conflict in Tigray?
Thank you very much, Atul Ghazal. Maybe before I start, if I could just express my deep sorrow for what the country is going through at the moment, particularly the Tigrayan people, and I have many friends in the region, but also extended families and people across the country. And I do hope that the forces come together to bring a sustainable peace soonest. So you asked me what I felt the main causes of the conflict are. And I think when we talk about conflict, there are causes, the trigger, and symptoms. And I think it's not in dispute what the trigger was to this conflict. It was an armed attack on the military outposts of the Northern Command in the Tigray region. However, we could also talk about the many symptoms of the conflict that widened the goalposts, I would say, between the federal government and the TPLF, that really made conflict in some ways inevitable. And those symptoms went beyond views towards the election, and some elections, the regional election taking place, the federal election not taking place, went beyond the frustrations caused by the central government's change in the currency and other reforms. But I think it really concerns some assumptions about the extent to which the new Abiy administration would continue with a form of federalism that was underpinned by certain processes and symptoms that became changed quite rapidly after the Abiy government came into power. And I think there were also miscalculations that were made about the instability that would be caused by many leaders from the security sector and the politicians going back, returning to Tigray, some on a voluntary basis, some on a forced basis, and irrespective of the efforts to reconcile with that large number of leaders and that leadership capacity, it led to a real securitization of the region, securitization that superimposed on top of an already unsustainable model for security in a federalist structure. And that was regional security forces that included forces with paramilitary capacities that had a direct accountability to the regional government. And in a true democratic society, this is unsustainable for the very reason that you could have different regional leadership. You could have different regional leaders affiliated with different political parties in a democracy. And at some times they might have disagreements or other views compared to the view at the federal center. And you can't have a militant force that is accountable to that view only. Beyond that, there were ceilings or numbers of sworn members in these security forces, weapons and types of weapons and the use of those weapons that went way beyond the constitutional limits that were put, making a lot of those armed elements unconstitutional.
You raised the issue of the transition from former Prime Minister Haile Mariam to Dr. Abiy. as to the foundations of the country, the federalism aspect, there was no change. And I mean, at least in terms of institutional and constitutional terms, there was no change. That transition instigates the TPLF to take the action it took? Or why would that concern the TPLF? Draw from the government and go back to Tigray? Why would that concern them? What are the reasons they were worried about?
Well, I would disagree with you with the greatest respect on the statement that there was no great change. There was no great change in the framework, the encapsulating framework around which the party operated. But there was a significant leadership change from within. And there was a significant will to take forward political reforms that departed greatly from a model that TPLF members had developed, and the underpinning doctrine that supported that model had developed and really committed themselves to over the years. And that departure, I think, caused a great deal of angst. And so I think there was a lot of change that way. And it speaks to the uniqueness of the situation in Ethiopia as well, because, you know, rarely do you see such broad-scale change from within the same party. Usually it's the case of a different party coming in altogether, and a change of leadership through that course of action. So I think it was really the systems and the processes underpinning the way the economy worked, the way rule of law was exercised, those defining features of what should account for a democratic society, and the systems and processes that sat beneath them, and the conduct of the agencies and the guardians of those processes. They were going through widespread change. So I think the aggregate outcome was certainly big change.
No, I agree. There have been a shift in the power balance between the parties. But in terms of the political order of the country, the constitution and the institution, there are aspirations for change, but there was no change yet. And the only way that could be changed is through the constitutional system. That was what I was referring to. But I want to ask one more question, though. 3 years before Dr. Abiy came to power, the country was ungovernable. There was a revolt all over this country. Wouldn't that suggest, at least, wouldn't that suggest to the TPLF leadership or to other observers that some change, some correction to the political order was inevitable?
Well, I think it did, and I think as we saw the executive committees of all the coalition members sit before Christmas of 2017 and after Christmas in the early months of 2018, and as those long Gimgama meetings occurred, we saw acknowledgement that the party had failed the country, and also an acknowledgement that reforms were required, change was required, and that started with the change of leadership. However, you know, after a party rules for so long, it's the capacity to accept too many changes all at once when they become part of that change can be limited. And it's easy to break out into victor vanquished politics as well. And one could argue that there was a lack of full political reconciliation around that. And perhaps that's what was needed. But, you know, we don't have many case studies that we can learn from around the world in terms of this broad-scale change from within the same party and the different direction that was taken, a direction that would have been at odds with the direction envisaged by what was the leading party before Abiy's administration led.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I will go to my next question. So how would you characterize, or what would you say is the current status of the country?
Well, I think the current status of the country is that there are pockets of instability in different areas, the most prominent of which is in the Tigray region, where there are some serious humanitarian issues. There are questions concerning the role of third parties, such as Eritrea and Eritrean armed forces and soldiers. There are questions concerning the future governance structure of the region. There are questions concerning the sanctity of some of Ethiopia's borders. And there is a need for healing and dialogue processes. And I know the Ministry of Peace as the lead, and through initiatives like MINDS, the Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue, and Destiny Ethiopia, a lot of work is being done to try to push this reconciliation process forward, something that was intended before the conflict in Tigray, but something which I fear will not have the traction it needs in the region of Tigray without some truth and conflict facts being established. And I think that there are a lot of questions being asked at the moment as to some of the dynamics on the ground, dynamics that can't be observed because of the security risks, humanitarian access that that we hear cannot be enabled in some areas for reasons on one side due to the federal government's view of the security risks in these areas, and on the other side, the risk thresholds of some of the humanitarian aid organizations, some of which are just not permitted to operate in those conditions. But there are a lot of uncertainties about what's causing the internet blackouts, what caused the communication blackouts during the conflict, and now what's causing those blackouts to reemerge. The government is trying to communicate these issues to the people. It's getting caught up in a lot of firefighting to address a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that's being circulated on social media, very venomous and polarizing and divisive in some cases. But all of this information, and this is what we're facing with modern day warfare, is information warfare. These kind of narratives are shaping and informing the perception of the international community. And I think I'm quite accurate when I say that there's a lot of confusion in some corners, and some with Ethiopia's very important and close partners. So I think clarity on some of these issues is required, and I think some independent adjudication of those conflict facts would be very helpful to the Ethiopian government, to the Ethiopian people, and most of all, support the reconciliation process embedded in the national dialogue that the country is trying to take forward across the whole of the 10 regions, not just in Tigray.
Okay, you raised a very important issue. As you said, the Dr. Abiy governments, when it came to power, formed a reconciliation commission. And I know he was very well experienced, very well read in reconciliation, national reconciliation. Hugh, let's start with the basic definition of why a reconciliation is needed. And I know you have knowledge of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and also South Africa, and to some extent Canada also. What is the role of reconciliation in a conflict?
When you are trying to resolve a conflict in a way where there is room for everybody to come together and to work on solutions, you have to have a way to address the strong differences of opinion that exist. Generally speaking, federalism as a way of governing is a way of managing between the broad national interest as defined and the legitimate regional or provincial or other interests, some case ethnic, which have to be part of the mix but can't all exist at the same national level. And federalism is always about avoiding conflict and building common opportunities for cooperation. reconciliation is important when you go through a series of events, and we have gone through them in Canada on matters relating to how we treated First Nations, where the national record is not very good. We know what our friends in South Africa went through, and reconciliation was used really as a way of getting participants to share perspectives, to talk about different views of facts on the ground, to get them into a place where they can speak without fear of retribution, so that once those broad verities are on the ground, you can then begin to work with them in a fashion that respects all the players, but does so in a fashion that is constitutionally coherent. Certainly in Canada, it has produced a broad mix of measures based on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did its work in the 1990s and the early 2000s, produced tremendous information, which allowed for a system by which some of the matters that had to be addressed, whether it was restitution or property, whatever, could begin to be addressed in a reasonable way. And we know, of course, that in South Africa, the premise was very clear. You could not move forward unless you had some established facts, and that both victims of what had happened under apartheid and perpetrators could come into a public circumstance, share what they knew truthfully, again without fear of retribution, so that the facts are on the ground with which the South African Federation could begin to work. So that is a model which applies itself in many ways, and obviously with what Dr. Fitz-Gerald has said about the difficulties about different perspectives, different views of what did or did not happen, a reconciliation process within the context of the federal system in Ethiopia could be a very constructive way forward.
So do you foresee a reconciliation only for the particular conflict in Tigray and the federal government, or do you see a reconciliation across the board for all Ethiopians?
Well, generally speaking, the way in which the reconciliation process is structured and the way in which it is trusted by all participants makes it a very positive platform to be used constructively. Sometimes it is used because there's been a short-term difficulty that has emerged over the last, let us say, 9 months or 6 months or 3 months, where you have to do something relatively efficiently and get something up and running. But there's nothing to prevent a reconciliation process that works well with respect to one region and the federal government also to embrace discussions that might be helpful in other parts of the country as well. The important thing, I think, about federalism and why the democratic federal government of Ethiopia is so highly respected worldwide is because it does provide a measure for local autonomy. It does provide a measure for respecting of differences that may exist. It does provide a context within one respects different ethnicities and cultural backgrounds, but it also does not get in the way of a strong democratic federal state and the operation of its parliament, which understandably is what any country would want to achieve and what your present Prime Minister really has achieved so much with, despite the present difficulties.
Yeah, when we talk about federalism, I think many scholars argue that a precondition for federalism is democracy. The last 27 years under TPLF is never democratic. Not only that, there is the institutions that are built are sectarian. They are very much in contradiction to the federal government and to the nations, to the Ethiopian nationalism. And also the way it is structured and the way it was agreed to does not reflect the wishes and the wills of all the people. So many people argue federalism is good for Ethiopia, but ethnic federalism has never worked and will never work. So solely on ethnicity, federal entities solely on ethnicity do not work. I know you guys have the Quebec example, which is not similar. Maybe how would you address that?
Well, I'll offer a view and then I'll defer to Dr. Fitz-Gerald. I would say this. The great thing about federalism is its flexibility. In other words, it may operate in a period of time between regions. In some circumstances, and I think of federalism in Canada, federalism is between, if you wish, 10 provinces, but one province has a strong concentration of one kind of Canadian of French Catholic stock, and where the independent language and culture and the instruments of society, education are very important in terms of that group's sense of being properly and fairly treated within the federal structure. So we have a series of arrangements in Canada, and there's no reason that federal and regional governments in Ethiopia could not reflect on similar instruments. We have administrative arrangements. We have asymmetric federalism, where some programs that operate in some provinces, funded in part by the federal government, operate quite differently in other provinces because ethnic and other groups would want to see a different approach. And then there's a formula to ensure fair funding between all the players. So it's the intrinsic flexibility and conflict avoidance of federalism that provides the rich opportunity for countries to make progress, especially when they're dealing with areas of determined disagreement and some instability, which requires a framework for moving forward.
Okay. Anne, you want to add anything to that?
I would just add that I really like the concept of asymmetric federalism, and I think in Ethiopia this would take on other levels. I remember working in very remote regions in Ethiopia where at the Kabele level they would follow their own traditional approach to justice and using customary courts and traditional justice approaches, and that can all be preserved in an asymmetric federalist arrangement. Yes, things get complicated when different regions are associated with ethnicities, but I speak from a security basis because I'm professor of international security, and there are current systems and processes, which I started off talking about during this interview, that are just unsustainable in a working democratic federalist arrangement. And having security forces with paramilitary capability that could potentially compete with that same paramilitary capability, which in arrangements where that capability needed to be superseded by the federal entity, that might not be acceptable if that entity at the regional level has a direct line to the regional president. So, you know, democracy is not a negotiable concept. You can have a dialogue and a discussion on what democracy looks like or should look like in a particular society. But once those decisions have been taken, central tenets of democracy, such as rule of law, accountability, security, etc., are really non-negotiable. You can't have a little bit of some and a lot of others, and this is why issues to do with dialogue and reconciliation are so important, because every society around the world is extremely different, and there has to be some sort of agreement on those wider objectives and democratic aspirations that a society wants to move in the direction of. And then it's incumbent on a government to put the processes and systems in place to work towards those. And I think the system that you referred to that was in place before the Abiy administration was this idea of a strong center and a strong central security capacity and weaker voices at the regional level, particularly at some of the more peripheral and remote regions that weren't represented within the coalition. And the new administration had views to change this, and I think that was a healthy direction, particularly in the spirit of democracy. But that called for widespread change in the systems and the processes, and perhaps the lack of preparedness to accept that widespread change, and the lack of political conciliation that occurred to prepare the ground for that widespread change was something which, if hindsight was 2020, there could have been a bigger investment in. But I think, you know, that's also incompatible with modern day politics, which call for quick wins and early achievements. And arguably, the Prime Minister had a lot of other wolves at the door and foreign policy issues that he had to address.
Yeah. Before I move away from federalism, I want to ask a couple of questions. One is federal countries like Canada. We talked about Quebec and the high accumulation of francophones in Quebec. As you know, it's very diverse. I mean, there are Amaras, Gurages, Walaitas all over the country. In some areas, very high numbers, particularly in the cities for many, many, many years. Number one. Number two is the division of the ethnic boundaries were drawn by a victor, TPLF. When they came to power, they drew it. You know that there are territorial contentions among many of the federal components. So this makes the issue of national reconciliation very important. So maybe I should ask this. In your paper, you discuss about how Canada help Ethiopia move forward into democracy. So what can Canada provide for a transition to the next phase in democratizing Ethiopia? Hugh, you want to take this?
Sure, I'm glad to try. Look, I think because of the intense nature of federalism in Canada, the way in which our economic development and our social development has been shaped by federalism, the way in which federalism itself has changed over time in terms of how it operates, in terms of administrative arrangements, special arrangements for various ethnic groups in different parts of the country and language groups. There's a vast history and tradition there, which experts in that could make available to their Ethiopian colleagues in the context of whatever process Ethiopia may choose to launch relative to reconciliation internally. And we also have an extensive now group of individuals who were involved in the truth and reconciliation process within the last decade and a half, who went through some very, very difficult circumstances. We had some difficult circumstances where one ethnic group's children were literally, in the past, removed from their homes and put into the schools of other ethnic groups, religious groups, where they were treated very, very badly for many, 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 many decades. And that produced immense anger and sense of frustration and sense of loss on the part of the families of those groups, which we now refer to as the survivors. And that was something with which governments of all political affiliations had to address. That produced some formal apologies in Parliament. It produced a reconciliation process with an endless stream of material validating the nature of the suffering that went on, all of which was in the public domain. And that then produced a basis upon which the different groups could begin to work together within the Canadian federal system. It's not perfect, nothing is, but it was a basis upon which to go forward. And I think some of what happened in Canada would perhaps apply, and there's a very strong affinity between Canada and Ethiopia for many reasons, but particularly because they're both federal states. We both determined to advance democratic federalism. And I think that within any internal process that the government of Ethiopia may wish to achieve, there might very well be Canadians who could be helpful in a fashion that was independent of the particular difficulties that exist in Ethiopia, but awash, so to speak, in some of the similar problems elsewhere, which could be constructive for the way ahead in your country.
Thank you. And I know you know Ethiopia very well. You have worked there. Of course, you know Canada. And you have you are an advisor to the government of the United Kingdom. And you know the problems and the opportunities in Ethiopia. So where do we go? How do we move forward?
So you asked about what Canada can provide, how Canada can support. I think Hugh's raised a number of affinities that both countries have. We are very different countries. We come from very different places and experiences. Ethiopia is a cradle of thousands of years of civilization, and has a great deal to share with Canada, as much as we have to share with Ethiopia. And I just wanted to start by saying that. But in addition, I think this culture of dialogue, dealing with the past, discussing the past with as many stakeholder groups that are relevant to that discussion as possible, is a healthy system and culture to have in place. And I think there has to be discussions in Ethiopia about many things at the moment. You know, Prime Minister Abiy was not far off when he referred to the situation in Tigray, likened it to the American Civil War. I mean, the Ethiopians have mixed heritage. This is not Tigray against Ethiopia. It's brother against brother. And you know, hopefully we're not going to be using that term against anymore moving forward. But you know, families feud sometimes, but families still often repair those wounds and coexist peacefully in the future. And I'm sure that is what is going to happen in Ethiopia's future. But I think there is a real opportune moment with the preparation for a widespread national dialogue. I think that dialogue has the opportunity to have discussions on many different issues, including borders. I think the future of soft borders, no matter how much nations are straddling them, nations, nationalities, and peoples are straddling those soft borders, it can lead to problems if there is any ambiguity over these issues. And we've seen such ambiguity around Badme. We've seen such ambiguity around Al-Fashqa, around the contested area between Sudan and the Amhara region of Ethiopia. You know, sanctity of borders and democratic practices produce a predictable society. Predictable societies gain attention from other countries around the world. They attract investment. That leads to economic prosperity. Economic prosperity makes a country more secure, and a secure and stable country makes a country sovereign. And I think that the national dialogue is a very important precondition to enable that sequence of steps to further embolden and further strengthen the very many brilliant processes that Ethiopians have created in the past in making this very diverse and, in some places, a bit divided society work under a federalist system. But we have to be clear about what we think an Ethiopia democratic society should look like, agree on it should be incumbent on the government to put the necessary processes in place that are approved by Parliament to make that society function, and allow for it to be accountable to the people by having a healthy relationship with Parliament and a healthy relationship with its civil society. And I think this is something that needs to be developed in a much wider way, countrywide. For years, I worked with some civil society groups that were located in the urban centers, but the same effort to develop civil society in the peripheral regions was not there. And moreover, as a professor in international security, I was hard-pressed to find my counterparts in the fields of security, human rights, and justice because of the legal proclamation that prevented these groups from developing. So that has to open up. We need to have, vibrant higher education establishments and think tanks, NGOs that collectively can come together to form some real research integrity and research capacity to help government policy in the future be evidence-based policy. So I think these are all important tenets that are not so much related to an ongoing conflict and ongoing tensions in particular geographical areas, but will be germane to the discussion that needs to take place within the bounds of a national dialogue process.
Mm-hmm. Given your experience in Ethiopia, and as we discussed, national reconciliation is needed. It's very likely national reconciliation will not happen before the election, which is scheduled in the coming 5 months, 4 months. Do you think there is enough goodwill, enough willingness from the different political actors, those in the opposition, those who feel like aggrieved, those who feel like they won? I'm asking this because you have worked in Ethiopia for a while. Do you think there is sufficient political willingness to come to a national reconciliation, even though there is no other option? But do you think there is an option for that?
I think a meaningful reconciliation process before the election, the federal elections, is impossible, because a meaningful process requires time and requires stages. We've seen transitions in different parts of the world flip from one state of being to another overnight, and they haven't worked because they haven't taken those baby steps that make change sustainable. And that's what's required here, a phased approach, an approach which encapsulates the whole country, which brings the different actors together. And the Prime Minister made some laudable steps in trying to do that, open the political space. But if that political space is open, you have to, as members of that political space, contribute productively and constructively, and be a net contributor rather than a net user, be part of the solution. The opportunity in Ethiopia is just overwhelming, and I think you've got quite a few good leaders, a very educated society, a real growing middle class, and human development capacity. And I think if people could come together in a system that shows reflects the dialogue culture and the culture to come together and respect all views, and to respect the view and the development of independent agencies in that process as well, that willingness will set in with time. We don't know what's going to happen around the elections. Hopefully space will open to the maximum level for others to come and participate, and whose positions will all be respected, and whose positions following the elections will be respected as well. Ideas that are tabled in any kind of forum are better ideas if they are subject to debate and discussion. And there is a good parliamentary process in Ethiopia to facilitate that debate and discussion at the regional level, at the federal level. So actors must come and contribute richly to it, hold the government of the day to account, use evidence-based claims and arguments in order to constructively enrich the dialogue and not regressively slow down the dialogue. So I hope that answers the question. I'm very hopeful. Ethiopia has endured many more difficulties in the face of adversity in the past. It's proven to the world that it can get through time and again, and this time will be no exception.
Okay, thank you. Hugh, I want to come to you as I can say, an expert on reconciliation, and particularly given the Quebec issue and given Northern Ireland, people who have strong nationalist feelings, it takes them a long time to overcome that. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That's my observation. And the Ethiopian government has a huge challenge to transition from such an environment to a democratic environment. However, many countries, not Canada, maybe not the US, but particularly Europeans, and many media and intellectuals seem to make the transition quite difficult. How can the West, since you have a political experience, wouldn't it make sense for the West to help the transition with all its inefficiencies? I mean, this is a transition so that the country will be stable and move to democratic order?
Well, if you look at the reconciliation that took place between the different factions in Northern Ireland, where there was a very long period of interethnic violence, which was quite horrific, with many people having been killed, and bombs and explosions, and this was something which went on for many, many decades. In the end, it took a realization, on the part of government, both in Northern Ireland and in the Southern Republic, that the only way forward is to find a method of reconciliation. And one of the methods to build trust, and building trust is absolutely essential, was to make sure that the arms of the IRA, the arms of the Irish rebels, so to speak, were in fact done away with by agreement, but in a way that could be actually certified. And in that context, again, they went to a Canadian, a former chief of our defense staff, General John de Chastelain, who'd also been our ambassador to Washington, and there is no diplomatic position for Canada any more important than ambassador to Washington, and he was retained by a group of Irish, Northern Irish, involving advice from Canada and involving advice from Finland and others about how you actually organize the decommissioning of arms. And that was a process that went on for the better part of a year, supervised, but there was measures of trust built through the process. And in the end, it was not only the people who'd worked on that, the Irish themselves, the Canadian involved, the Finn and others, but also the Catholic bishop and the Protestant bishop, which spoke to the two warring sides, who certified that in the end, the arms had been destroyed. Therefore, violence as an option was no longer part of what a rational way forward for the Irish would be. And that has produced, in fact, without resolving all the problems, a tremendous growth and prosperity, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland to the south. It's produced a growth in economic opportunity. It's produced a growth in incoming investment, which was very good for generating jobs for young people. So, you know, there are difficult conflicts in the world, some that have been, even if I may say so, more difficult than what has been faced in the past and is now being addressed in Ethiopia, which do give us some lessons going forward. So I'm comfortable that if there's a will to try to achieve some measure of agreement about facts on the ground, there are various federal instruments that can be used by Ethiopians inside Ethiopia, between the federal government and regions, in a way that can make some progress. Of course, it depends on the will to do so, but obviously looking at some things that have gone on in areas of really intense difficulty in other parts of the world may be of some value.
Thank you. And I want to come to you, as reconciliation, as we say, takes time. But right now, the country is hurting, particularly in Tigray. We know people are hurting. So, what are the other necessary conditions that will enable us, when the time comes, to have a successful reconciliation?
I think the most important precondition is humanitarian support. I think and part and parcel of this humanitarian support to the Tigrayan people who are victims of the conflict. They didn't ask for this conflict, and they are the victims, particularly in some areas where humanitarian support is making a very food and basic provision insecure climate. Their dignity has to be prioritized as well. And it seems in some areas, particularly areas near the border, that the dignity of the Tigrayan people is being compromised. So I would say humanitarian support, and in parallel to all of this, I would say that we need to ensure that a dialogue starts with counterparts in the governance structure that are acceptable to the Tigrayan people, and that in parallel with the caretaker government administration that's in at the moment, we constantly engage and poll views with the Tigrayan groups to see what sort of arrangement they would like in their region, something that would be compatible with the existing regional type structures of the federal system, but something that they feel that they have called for themselves and they own. I think disarming, demobilizing, and reintegrating the former combatants into society, where some combatants will have to be brought to the courts to have their cases heard and to let the system of rule of law preside. We will have to see others being reintegrated. And I underline the term reintegration because sometimes we hear of what are dubbed as DDR processes around the world, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants. But sometimes fatigue and a lack of energy sets in when we get to reintegration. And the socioeconomic implications of the reintegration needed for soldiers who were part of this bloated regional force, and the bloated regional force doesn't just exist in Tigray, it exists elsewhere as well. They will need to be catered for in different ways, particularly getting their heads and existence around a civilian livelihood instead of a securitized and uniformed livelihood. We've talked about dialogue, making sure that there is clarity in the conflict facts, which Hugh has talked about, and which processes like the Northern Ireland intervention did help with, just bringing some sort of independent adjudicator. And this doesn't mean that the United Nations has to bring a commission in, or a commission associated with any other international organization. John de Chastelain went into Northern Ireland as an individual with great integrity, and someone who people were confident on both sides could bring some clarity to the conflict facts. And I think, as I've mentioned already, to reform the security structures. They're currently unsustainable, especially with the numbers we have. They're currently dangerous in some ways, and compared to federal forces, and I've experienced this personally, there is a bit of a delta between their levels of professionalism and the professionalism and development that has been experienced by the federal forces. So, and I think, there does need to be some investigation into these claims that Eritrea soldiers are committing atrocities and human rights abuses. If there is truth to that, and there are many individuals talking about it at the moment, then it's important not for just a military solution to address that at the operational level, but for a political solution. And I think leadership has to engage with its Eritrean counterparts, call for the pulling back of those soldiers. And, we are talking here about one of a country that has been acclaimed to have one of the most repressive leaders in the world. And, I think the assumption that the armed forces that operate under President Afwerki's leadership, that they wouldn't be the most professional armed forces, and that conduct might be questionable in areas where they come into close proximity with townspeople in Ethiopia, comes with an element of risk. And I think this risk has to be addressed, and measures have to be taken to make things less ambiguous. I mean, it's Ethiopia's borders were porous to begin with, and you know, hardly any countries in the world, let alone across the African continent, have the capacity to patrol their borders tightly at every turn. But we know where the contentious areas are, and I think some sort of interim agreement, until stability is reached and until further dialogue can happen in terms of implementing the Algiers agreement formally, some sort of political provisions have to be agreed to bring whatever untoward activity is being engaged with under control.
I will just note that the issue of Eritrea is widely reported, but there has never been authoritative verification. But to Hugh, I will give you a chance to conclude our program. Anything you want to add?
Greatest of respect I say this for the greatest of respect for the sovereignty of Ethiopia and the need for Ethiopians to make their own decisions in a way that's appropriate for Ethiopia's own interests. But I look at the Ethiopian federal system and all its complexities, and it is complex, but it also has a measure of hope because of the way in which different parts of the country can, if they want to, work together. There are difficulties now which have to be addressed, but it would be a terrible mistake to underestimate the ability of people to work together when there are frameworks and expressions of goodwill and trust-building undertakings about facts on the ground, which could make that easier going forward. So I remain a great admirer of Ethiopia and a tremendous optimist about the challenges ahead.
And I will give you a chance to conclude. And as you know, I don't know if you know her, there is Yetneber. She is a deputy executive. I hope you work with her. I really appreciate your contribution. Any concluding remarks or anything I forgot?
No, I think, you know, I've been delighted to be asked to be on the show today, and delighted to appear with such an eminent leader as Hugh Segal on the show. And, you know, my heart is with all my Ethiopian friends at the moment. I consider it my second home in many ways. And I feel that stability and a solution is firmly in sight, and that all the hard efforts by all groups need to come together to galvanize that strength and momentum behind the dialogue and reconciliation process. And maybe we should talk about a healing process more generally, and time taken to square the circle on things that didn't have that time to take root after the Abiy administration came into power. But you know, as I sometimes say when I'm drawing pictures for my children and we're trying to unpack a little problem on a diagram, I sometimes use the expression, all roads lead to Rome. And I explain it to them that everything comes back to one thing that seems to be an overriding prerequisite. And I think an overriding prerequisite here is one that both Hugh and I have raised about the importance of truth. And just putting that truth on the record in the wake of some very venomous information warfare that's being carried out in parallel with the tensions on the ground. And I think any support that Ethiopia can reach out to help with that, if it doesn't think it can carry that process forward itself, is important. And I would just thank you, Amasegnalo, and wish you all the best moving forward.
Thank you, Anne Fitz-Gerald, Professor Anne Fitz-Gerald from Waterloo, Canada. And thank you, Senator Hugh Segal. I hope I will for sure invite you in the future. And it's nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Great privilege. Thank you
very much.
Okay. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.